You mentioned the statute. I was thinking, like, when you're at the Federal Bar Association, was there commentary discussion about making immigration Article One core? Did they get into that at all, with the government lawyers being there too, or
Yeah.
I imagine they discussed that a little bit.
Yeah, the panel didn't discuss it, but I talked about that with Betty Stevens, who used to be the FBA immigration section head, and who is kind of leading that fight and who testified before Congress. I talked to her again. I talked to her on the podcast, and I talked to her at the conference, and the FBA's sponsored bill has made it out of committee in the House, I think. Don't quote me on it. And so I guess it goes to the Senate, and then there's reconciliation. But they have gone further than ever in making immigration judges Article 1 judges, and the board. It's further than it's ever been. For better or for worse.
Yeah.
I think that there's good and bad for non-citizens in both. I tend to lean towards supporting Article 1 for a variety of reasons, but it does seem like there's momentum behind it.
Yeah. I'm interested in seeing I think it's the Office of Budget Management or something like that, OBM, like something that breaks down like the cost, because they're gonna have to create a whole court structure, and like immigration courts as they're usually like office rooms with like they stuff 50 people in. If it's a federal court, they have to like put infrastructure in there. It's just gonna see how that practically works out, but it just makes sense for that. The immigration courts as they are. Most immigration attorneys obviously pro that happening, but I wonder what downside there would be. Like be careful what you wish for kind of thing once it does happen.
Well, there is one. I mean, there's one downside. For example, I talked about this at length on the podcast. Check it out, Immigration Review, special episode with Betty Stevens. I mean, one of the downsides the FBA put in there is it would provide oil the authority to petition for review to the circuit. Currently, if the government, if ICE loses at the board, that's the end of it. The non-citizen wins. Yeah. Oil cannot petition for review to the circuit. But this, making them Article 1 judges, would provide DOJ that authority to petition for review to the circuits. For example, another, the greater, I don't necessarily subscribe to it because I worked for immigration judges who were appointed by all sorts of presidents and who had all sorts of backgrounds. But, it's no secret that the prior administration has appointed about 50% of the current immigration judges and more than that at the board, I think. And that a lot of them came with prosecution backgrounds, be it in federal court or at ICE.
Yeah.
And so before immigration judges get more power, there's an argument to be made that the bench should better reflect the practice of immigration law and not be so heavily biased towards a prosecutorial background. On the other hand, judges are judges. And quite frankly, the federal bench is also heavily weighed to prosecutorial background. And I don't think many people argue that the federal bench is unfair. So I think that maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm a romantic, but I think putting on the robe brings out the best in individuals.
I have to read
they try to get past their background.
There's a big issue of a lot of federal benches constantly being empty, and then presidents coming in. They have to keep there's just a lot of empty seats that got to be approved by the Senate. And so it's like, are they going to? I have to read the bill, but are they going to make it easier to choose immigration judges? Because there's going to be a lot of people to be chosen. Obviously, there's this 1.5 million backlog, so they need tons of judges all of a sudden. Are they going to have the difficulty of approving it with the same standard as a district judge or something like that? Or are they going to are these going to be a different kind of Article 1 judge? I should say Article 1, they have to be able to consent to the Senate kind of thing.
I also talked about this with Betty. I had a similar. You gotta listen, man. You gotta listen. You're showing your cards. You didn't listen to my stuff.
I'm making a note to make sure I watch it. I'm very interested now.
She said that the president is going to nominate, and the Senate will, I don't know, I guess confirm. It's not the same as Article 3 judges, but only the board members, I believe. And then the board members will be able to then appoint under Article 1 all immigration judges. So you're not going to have 600 immigration judges going to Washington. It's only going to happen with the BIA members who are currently sitting in Falls Church anyway. Something like that.
Okay, that's not. I'm not sure that's much better than what we have right now because the BIA, like, it could go either way based on the makeup of the BIA. It could go massive directions here and there.
Well, there's still and the Attorney General gets taken out completely of this equation. By the way, once they become Article 1, that is
It's kind of
also
better. Yeah.
a thing.
Whole employee of the Justice Department as a judge, it doesn't make any sense. So you have like both the prosecutor and the judge both on one team. It's not in part. That part of it never made any sense to me. Probably
Yeah,
doesn't make sense to the judges either.
I worked for UIR under the Obama administration, and I saw no collusion between IJs and DHS, and I did not get that feeling. In fact, some IJs I knew and worked for were harder on ICE than they were on the private bar. But I lived the last 4 years under the Trump administration just like you, and did see things that seemed to undermine the independence of immigration judges. So
Even their own union said
even,
as such, controlling
even
their docket, all this kind of stuff. So not necessarily collusion, but it's just at the end of the day, it's that they're employees of the Justice Department, so they're controlled in a sense. They don't have the independence that judiciary
yeah.
has. So that's
And that's why I tend to lean towards making them Article 1 judges, even though I might not agree with, I don't know, the majority of current immigration judges. I don't know, maybe I do. But even though I would feel better if somebody who didn't want to build a wall had been the one who appointed 50% of the immigration bench, maybe I'd feel better about it. But I think long term, if you raise the bar, you make everything more formal, I think that it helps everything in the legitimacy of the court. Maybe it's naive.
There's some court packing possible with the BIA too, because they don't have the restrictions on the number of BIA judges. So we worry about the Supreme Court, but they could be court packing the BIA and then choose. That's
Well,
another aspect.
the prior administration did pack the BIA.
Yeah.
They expanded and they packed the BIA. It's not something that's talked about nearly enough.